Did he forget where he is again? Someone get Grandpa back to bingo night. The room chuckled, but the old man didn't flinch. He tightened his grip on the cane, stepped forward and said, "Clear the board. You've been solving it wrong." They rolled their eyes until the lights flickered. The simulation shifted. His plan worked. He brought no laptop, wore no uniform, just a cane, and eyes that had seen both the Cold War and cyber warfare. They called him Senile until he beat a $2 billion simulation from memory. When the entire unit was presumed eliminated, the man they called outdated saved them all. This is the story of the forgotten strategist and how he silenced a room full of generals. Are you ready to know the truth? The Tactical Warfare Simulation Center was unlike anything the public had ever seen. Hidden beneath reinforced steel and satellite domes in a remote Nevada facility, it was where tomorrow's battles were fought, not with bullets, but with code, data, and AI-generated war rooms. Inside, high-ranking officers moved like surgeons through rows of holographic displays. Live data streamed in from orbital satellites. AI analysts ran predictive wargaming scenarios involving enemy drone swarms, EMP countermeasures, cyber attacks, and simulated hostage extractions. This wasn't just a military training ground. It was the crown jewel of next-generation warfare, a place where only top-tier strategists, SEAL team leaders, and covert unit commanders were allowed entry. So when a civilian transport van pulled up outside the gate and a 78-year-old man with a cane stepped out, unaccompanied, unarmed, and visibly out of place, the staff inside couldn't help but stare. His name was Hank Mallory. To most of the young soldiers inside, that name meant nothing. Just another forgotten veteran on a goodwill tour. But a few in the room, the older ones, the ones with folders marked declassified, level 4 clearance only, paused, ever so slightly. Hank had once been one of them. Not a soldier with a gun, but a man who crafted battles with silence. Back in the Cold War, he served as a psychological warfare strategist, a shadow thinker whose influence didn't come from rank, but from unpredictability. Hank had saved lives not with bullets, but with deception, disinformation, and mind games that never made it into textbooks. Now he lived in a quiet, assisted living facility on the outskirts of a forgettable town. His own son rarely visited. The staff said he drifted at times, sometimes confusing timelines, sometimes quoting Russian code names out loud during breakfast. They thought it was dementia. But when the Tactical Center launched a new PR initiative called Honor the Mind Behind the Mission, Hank's name had surfaced in an old file. A junior analyst, barely old enough to rent a car, found his name and decided to invite him, more out of curiosity than genuine recognition. And now here he was, standing in a facility run by men half his age, being escorted by a polite but clearly skeptical young officer. The people inside greeted him with polite indifference at best and condescending amusement at worst. Some offered a nod. Others whispered, "Who's the grandpa?" One chuckled, "Careful, he might think it's still 1965. But Hank said nothing. He simply looked around. His eyes didn't flick with confusion. They scanned. Not like someone lost, like someone measuring. They didn't know it yet, but the man they dismissed as a relic was about to remind them why some strategies never age. The scenario was titled Operation Black Grid, a high-intensity, full-spectrum warfare simulation designed to stress test the next generation of special operations officers. The setting, a digitally rendered urban sprawl resembling Eastern Europe. Narrow streets, compromised infrastructure, civilians scattered. The complication, the enemy had deployed electronic suppression fields. No GPS, no drones, no satellite relay. The objective, extract a high-value prisoner from a fortified building in the middle of an ever-shifting digital war zone. This was no ordinary drill. It was built to break even the best, and it was working. Inside the control center, the room buzzed with frustration. 3 teams had already failed. Red team just lost another operator. AI estimates full squad elimination in 4 minutes. The young officers scrambled, swiping through maps, inputting commands, adjusting troop movement on touchscreens. But the moment they adapted, the simulation evolved faster. Enemy drones shifted tactics. Communications were jammed. Routes were blocked before they could even be charted. A lead strategist, early 30s, confident, wearing the weight of recent promotions, muttered under his breath, "This thing is rigged. It's not supposed to be winnable." Nearby, General Stokes, the director of the center, leaned back in his chair and sipped his black coffee. A decorated veteran of modern cyber warfare, he had designed the simulation himself. "That's the point," he replied dryly. "No tech, no backup, just brains." He glanced over to the observation deck, where Hank Mallory sat quietly behind the glass, watching. Still, silent, eyes sharp. Around him, younger analysts whispered, chuckled, and occasionally snuck glances. Still waiting for him to ask where the restroom is. "Maybe we can plug his cane into the console and see if it boots up. Let's just hope he doesn't mistake the holograms for ghosts from the war." Stokes smirked. Then came the alert. "Simulation failure. Total force loss, 92.3%. Everyone froze for a moment. Third wipeout in less than an hour. Stokes sighed, spun slowly in his chair, and without looking directly at anyone, said loud enough for the room to hear, "All right, let's give Grandpa a shot. Can't be worse than watching these kids fumble around." The room broke into laughter. Even the more senior officers smirked. But Hank stood. Without waiting for an invitation, he grabbed his cane, walked calmly to the center console, and rested one hand on the edge of the display table. "Clear the board," he said. "You've been solving it wrong." The room quieted slightly, not out of respect, but out of discomfort. It was the first time he had spoken all day. Someone at the back snorted. Stokes raised an eyebrow, half amused, half curious. "All right, Hank," he said, gesturing mockingly. "Let's see what Cold War logic looks like in a digital battlefield." Hank didn't respond. He simply tapped the map with the cane, and for the first time in the entire simulation, he disabled the AI assistant. "If you want to win this, stop thinking like a machine." The room went still. Hank Mallory, steady as ever, stood over the war table. His eyes scanned the simulation feed like a composer studying a complex score. Except he wasn't interested in rhythm. He was listening for chaos. "First," he said, his voice low but firm, "disable all AI assistants." A pause, no one moved. Then a young tech whispered to Stokes, "He can't be serious." "I'm serious," Hank repeated without turning. "The computer is too smart to beat with logic, so stop using logic." One technician sighed but followed the order. The glowing overlays on the display blinked out. The predictive models, the enemy tracking, the probability meters, gone. The war room suddenly looked bare, exposed, vulnerable. "Next," Hank said, tapping his cane on the screen, "strip the digital map, switch to coordinate grid overlay, manual inputs only. No GPS." The simulation team hesitated again. This was archaic. No one had fought like that in decades. But under Stokes' amused shrug, the text complied. The map reverted to a black and green grid. Old-school mil-spec coordinates and topographical lines. Some in the room chuckled. "What's next? Carrier pigeons?" someone muttered. Then came the kicker. "I want radio frequencies restricted to narrowband analog, disable encryption protocols, use static pattern call signs, and I want battlefield flares and auditory signals, whistles, percussion, echoes. No digital comms." The silence in the room this time was heavier. Some assumed this was theater, that Hank was just playing the role of crazy old vet for effect. But then he started giving orders, not to the staff, to the team inside the simulation. Inside the VR rig, the operatives adjusted, confused by the sudden lack of GPS. No comms, no drones, just a cold, silent city under siege. Then they heard it. 3 short bursts, like a whistle, faint, then echoed from another rooftop. Then 2 bursts from the far side. One of the simulated operatives paused. "Was that a signal?" Back in the command room, Hank was tracking by ear. "They're listening," he said calmly. "Good." He leaned forward and issued his first field command. "Have Bravo Squad retreat west into Sector G4, but make sure one of them stomps hard down that alley. We want the enemy drones to follow the sound." Another officer scoffed. "Sound? That's not how drones track." Hank didn't flinch. It is when the AI's been fed too much of sound-based triangulation training. We'll feed it noise until it chokes on false positives. The simulation adapted. Enemy drones shifted, recalculating patterns. But they overcompensated, just as Hank predicted. He was exploiting a weakness not in the hardware, but in the machine learning. Back during the Cold War, Hank had studied Soviet over-reliance on pattern projection, how enemy analysts would predict action based on known logic. So he designed campaigns to act illogically on purpose. Now he was applying the same principle to AI. This isn't war, he muttered. It's math. And math can be misled. He ordered operators to light battlefield flares in strange sequences, not to signal each other, but to confuse heat signature tracking. He had them retreat from secure positions, only to re-enter from the flank 10 seconds later. He instructed a decoy unit to move in figure-8 patterns while creating loud percussion echoes using walls and pipes. One younger commander finally stepped closer to General Stokes. "Sir, it's like he's trying to make the AI think they're everywhere at once." Stokes raised his eyebrows. "Exactly." Then came the boldest move yet. "Have Alpha Team break formation," Hank said. "Send them charging toward the main courtyard, but not to engage." "Why?" the tech asked, concerned. "That's suicide." "Because it's madness," Hank answered, "and nothing screws with a thinking machine. Like deliberate madness." The simulated team obeyed. AI units began shifting, unsure whether to engage, retreat, or hold position. The enemy formation glitched briefly. 2 seconds later, the simulated prisoner was extracted from the building. Mission status: extraction complete. Survival rate: 82%. The room gasped. For a moment, no one spoke. The simulation hadn't just been beaten, it had been outplayed. No tech, no assistance. Just signals, psychology, and the kind of unpredictable strategy no machine could ever fully learn. Hank took a step back and let his cane rest on the floor. "You all thought I forgot where I was," he said calmly. "But the truth is, you forgot where this started." And with that, the room, once full of doubt and smirks, stood in stunned silence. At first, the young officers watched Hank's tactics with skepticism, a kind of detached curiosity, as if watching a nostalgic war movie playing out in real time. But that changed when the data started shifting. Enemy kill probabilities began to drop, not because the operatives had better aim, but because the AI couldn't predict them anymore. "Sir, the drones are hesitating," a technician said, eyes wide as live readings glitched and recalibrated every few seconds. "They're stuttering between priorities. Movement analysis is all over the place." Hank gave a half smile, not of pride, but of recognition. That's what happens when you stop behaving like a soldier and start behaving like a ghost. And then it happened. The younger tacticians, the same ones who had chuckled earlier, started mimicking him. One junior lieutenant leaned over the console and muttered, "Let's trigger a false acoustic pattern across 3 rooftops. Mimic the echo from Sector C. Pull their sensors toward a dead zone." Another officer whispered, "Can we load pre-recorded comms on analog frequencies? Fake voices? Trick the AI into thinking backups en route?" Someone else added, "We still have smoke charges in the sim, right? What if we light up a rooftop and reflect infrared to blind their optics?" Suddenly, the room was alive, not with panic, but with innovation, not reacting to AI's actions, but manipulating its logic. It was no longer about who had the best strategy. It was about who could think irrationally on purpose and make it look real. Inside the simulation, the operators moved like shadows through the war-torn grid. Following Hank's lead, they did what no algorithm could trace. They became unpredictable. One team lit a barrel fire in a stairwell, generating thick smoke that distorted thermal imaging. Another broadcast a looped message of false orders, recorded in a low, trembling voice. "This is Task Force Echo. Reinforcements inbound. Hold your ground." One unit intentionally left behind equipment as decoys, a pair of boots, a helmet with a blinking light, to mislead the enemy into thinking they were still present. The AI attempted to compensate. It failed. Its logic engine couldn't reconcile deliberate chaos. Instead of adjusting, it began splitting its focus, sending patrols in opposite directions, halting drone swarms mid-flight, hesitating at every junction. "Sir, the AI's trying to adapt," a technician said nervously, "but it's stuck. It's, it's confused." General Stokes raised an eyebrow. "Good," he said. "Let it be." And then, at minute 23:17, it happened. A warning alert flashed across every screen in the room. Unexpected result. Simulation outcome altered. Mission status, objective secured. Forces exfiltrated with 82% survival rate. Tactical approach, non-standard, strategic deception confirmed. The room froze. Mouths dropped. Chairs rolled back. One officer removed his headset and just stared at the main screen, blinking. No one had ever beaten the black grid scenario. Not once. Not even with full AI support and state-of-the-art analysis tools. And now, a 78-year-old man with no access to the system, no tech, and no formal rank had done it in less than 20 minutes. "It's not possible," someone whispered. But it was. Because while they had been trying to win with technology, Hank had beaten it with understanding. Not of machines, but of how machines think, and more importantly, how to make them doubt. For a moment, no one knew what to say. Then from the observation deck, one of the older colonels stood and slowly began to clap. Another followed, then another. Before long, the entire room, filled with commanders, analysts, engineers, and soldiers, was on their feet, applauding a man they had dismissed as irrelevant. Hank Mallory didn't bow. He didn't even smile. He simply turned back toward the window, looked down at the now-still simulation grid, and tapped his cane twice against the floor. Click, click. A quiet salute, not to himself, but to the operatives who followed his voice. The applause eventually faded, but the silence that followed carried more weight than the noise. Viewers watching the replay didn't know the full story yet. The young officers still didn't understand who had just saved the mission. Not really. So let's go back. Decades before the simulation, long before the AI systems, the touchscreen maps, and the satellite uplinks. Back to when Hank Mallory was not a forgotten name, but a whispered one. Eastern Europe, 1974. The Cold War was in full tilt. A classified NATO listening post had been compromised in the Carpathian Mountains, surrounded, cut off, and under threat of annihilation. Two full companies were trapped, communications severed, terrain unstable, weather brutal. Conventional options, useless. Command suggested evacuation, or worse, abandonment. But a junior strategist, recently transferred to the NATO Psychological Operations Wing, stepped forward with a different proposal. That man was Hank Mallory, age 27. His plan? A deception strategy so elaborate, so carefully layered, that it bordered on madness. He used captured enemy radios to broadcast fake distress calls from their own side. He staged false movement signals using timed sound traps on hillsides. He coordinated mirrored torch formations that mimicked an encircling force, when in reality, no such unit existed. He planted leaflets printed with false intel in abandoned outposts the enemy would discover. The result? The enemy believed a full armored battalion was en route. They retreated overnight, and the two companies, over 180 soldiers, were extracted without a single shot fired. But here's the twist. The mission was so sensitive, so buried in Cold War secrecy, that no official record was ever kept. No medals, no commendation, no classified archive even, just a silent report marked Operation Null, Strategic Misperception Confirmed. The man who designed it? Buried beneath red tape and silence. And as the Cold War faded and the digital age rose, Hank Mallory, the man who once turned shadows into victory, became just another file in an unmarked drawer. When the 1990s arrived, the Department of Defense underwent a sweeping modernization effort. New minds, new methods, new tech. Old strategists were politely asked to retire. And those like Hank, who refused to embrace GPS and computer modeling, were labeled outdated. One internal memo read, "Mallory's methods are rooted in improvisation and analog misdirection. largely incompatible with modern predictive systems. Another stated, he relies too heavily on instinct, unreliable in future planning. And just like that, Hank Mallory, once the ghostwriter of Battlefield Mind Games, was erased from relevance. But today, inside the most advanced tactical simulator the military had ever built, a man with no computer, no rank, and no digital support had succeeded where systems had failed. Not because the battlefield changed, but because the human mind still mattered. He didn't beat the simulation with tech. He beat it by seeing what the machine couldn't. That randomness could be precision in disguise. That irrational behavior could be calculated strategy. That fear, planted at just the right frequency, could override even machine logic. In the end, Hank never told the room about the mission in 1974. He never mentioned the soldiers he saved. He never talked about being erased. But as the simulation faded to black and his cane echoed once more on the polished floor, those who saw what he'd done that day understood something deeper. Strategy doesn't expire. It evolves, but its soul remains human. And perhaps, just perhaps, the greatest tactician in the room was the one they nearly forgot. The simulation room was quiet now. No flashing alerts, no commands being barked, just the hum of screens and the weight of realization. The moment the mission success message lit up and confirmed an 82% survival rate, the atmosphere shifted. What had begun as an experimental display, even a joke to some, ended with an undeniable truth. The old man had done the impossible, and now people were lining up. One by one, officers approached Hank Mallory. Men and women in pressed uniforms, polished boots, many of whom hadn't even bothered to acknowledge him earlier, now stood before him, not out of formality, but out of respect. A young lieutenant, barely 26, still with the buzz cut of a fresh academy graduate, reached out his hand and said, "Sir, I've never seen anything like that." Another officer, more seasoned but no less humbled, followed. "We studied algorithms. You taught us intuition." One even offered a faint smile, adding, "If that was senility, I'd take it over our AI any day." For the first time that day, Hank's lips curled into something almost resembling a smile. Not pride, recognition, maybe even quiet redemption. Later that evening, while most of the staff had gone home, a headline was posted to the military's internal communication network, one that reached bases from Alaska to Okinawa. "The man they labeled senile just taught us how to outsmart machines." Our Military Strategic Research Digest. The article opened with a photo, a candid shot of Hank standing with one hand resting on his cane, the other pointing at the simulation board mid-command. His figure contrasted against the soft glow of blue monitors and the stiff-backed soldiers around him. The story included quotes from General Stokes himself. "We've spent so much time teaching our officers to rely on systems, on logic trees, on predictive models, that we forgot how wars are really won through misdirection, instinct, and unpredictable human thought." Hank Mallory didn't just beat the simulation, he reminded us why strategy can't be automated. Within the week, the Tactical Warfare Simulation Center underwent a policy update. For the first time in over 2 decades, a new program was added to their training curriculum: Legacy Logic, Traditional Strategic Thinking in the Age of AI. It wasn't optional, it was mandatory for every new command trainee. Topics included analog deception techniques, counter-AI psychological disruption, pattern-breaking maneuvering under machine surveillance, historical war deceptions from World War II, Vietnam, and the Cold War, including several tactics pulled directly from Hank's undocumented methods. The irony? They now trained soldiers using a playbook that once got Hank dismissed from the very system he had now reshaped. And as for Hank, he didn't ask for a medal. He declined the offer for a formal ceremony. He didn't want his name on a wall or a plaque or a wing of the facility. But when General Stokes offered him a seat, a permanent advisor's role to the center, with full clearance and flexible hours, Hank simply replied, "Only if I don't have to wear the uniform again. And if the coffee's decent." It was. From then on, once a week, Hank returned to the command floor. Not to run simulations, but to listen. To watch young commanders falter, then guide them with only a question or a raised eyebrow. He never gave them answers. He helped them find their own misdirection. And quietly, something else began happening. Soldiers started stopping by the bench outside the building, where Hank liked to sit under a shaded awning between sessions. They asked questions. How did you know the drones would split? What made you choose Sector G over E? Why use sound over heat? Sometimes he answered. Sometimes he didn't. But always, they listened. And in those quiet conversations, over lukewarm coffee and fading light, the real lessons were passed on. In a world rushing toward automation, AI, and digitized warfare, one lesson became clear. Strategy is not a science, it's an art. And no matter how advanced the system, how predictive the machine, or how cold the data, a mind trained to think sideways, to zig when the world expects a zag, will always find a way through the grid, just like Hank did, and always will. A week after the simulation, the Tactical Warfare Simulation Center held a quiet ceremony. Just a handful of officers, a few brass pins, and a framed certificate stamped with a Pentagon seal. But Hank didn't show up. He had politely declined. When General Stokes called to offer him a medal, a token of gratitude for invaluable insight and contribution to modern tactical thinking, Hank gave a simple answer. I don't need a medal. I just need you to remember this. Strategy doesn't live inside a machine. It lives in the heart of the soldier brave enough to think differently. And that was that. But the impact, it spread like wildfire. Not through the news, but through whispered retellings between officers, shared documents between units, and quiet admiration among those who used to scoff at old tactics. One young officer, barely past 30, asked for a private meeting with Hank before deploying overseas. Sir, he said with a humble tone, I'd like to apply your deception strategy to a live op. Not just to win, but to protect lives. Would you review my plan? Hank didn't give advice. He asked questions. And by the end of that conversation, the young officer walked away. Not just smarter, but bolder. Not just trained, but trusted. The last scene wasn't in a control room. It wasn't on a battlefield. It was somewhere quieter, softer. A sunny afternoon at the Crestwood Veterans Home. There, beneath an old tree with amber leaves and a crooked wooden bench, Hank sat with a small fold-out chessboard on his lap. He sipped his coffee, eyes narrowed at the pieces, calculating, testing, misdirecting. But this time, he wasn't playing alone. Across from him sat a young soldier, still in uniform, watching Hank's moves like sacred instructions. A second soldier arrived, then a third. Some brought notebooks, some brought silence, and all brought respect. They didn't call him sir, they didn't salute, they just listened. And in that quiet gathering, far from simulations and satellite feeds, the spirit of strategy, the kind that can't be downloaded or coded, lived on. Because in the end, Hank Mallory didn't need a ceremony to make an impact. His legacy wasn't carved in metals, but in the way others began to think. Slower, smarter, sideways, and maybe, just maybe, that's what real leadership looks like. Sometimes we overlook the quiet ones, the ones who sit silently in the corner, holding a cane instead of a tablet, the ones who don't speak unless spoken to, and even then respond with just a few words. But let this story be a reminder. Never underestimate someone just because they're old or quiet. Inside their silence may live entire battlefields of memory, maps the modern world hasn't even begun to draw. In an age where AI promises to outthink us, where machines learn faster and systems make decisions before we even blink, there's something we're in danger of forgetting. Wisdom isn't programmable. Experience can't be downloaded. And instinct, that unteachable, unpredictable human spark, still wins wars. Hank Mallory didn't just beat a simulation. He reminded us that leadership isn't always loud, and brilliance isn't always packaged in youth or tech. He showed us that sometimes, the most advanced tactic is one whispered decades ago and remembered only by those who lived through it. So now we turn the question to you. Have you ever learned something truly valuable from someone the world had written off? Maybe a grandfather who taught you patience, A neighbor who knew how to fix anything with just his hands? Or a retired teacher who once said a single sentence that still echoes in your life? Share that lesson in the comments below. Let's remind each other and the world that the minds we too often ignore may be the ones that shape the very ground we stand on. And if Hank's story moved you, if it stirred a memory or inspired a second thought about the people we dismiss too easily, please consider liking, subscribing to this channel. We share stories that aren't trending, but are timeless. Stories of quiet strength, forgotten brilliance, and the kind of courage that doesn't come with applause, but deserves it all the same. Thank you for staying with us until the end. Until the next story, stay curious, stay kind, and never stop listening, especially to the quiet ones.